Hi, friends. This is the Making Sense of Faith podcast. My name is Adam Hamilton, and this is the Christmas week edition, which means we have most of our staff are out. So I'm doing this on my iPhone, at least part of it, the opening, here at my house. This is my Christmas tree. This is my dog, Rocky. Actually, our dog, Rocky. Levon's with me today. And just want to wish you a Merry Christmas. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about, okay, I'm going to put you down. You're a sweet dog. Yes, you are. Okay, there you go. I thought I might tell you a little bit about what goes into the candlelight Christmas Eve service and sermon. I know some of you may not go to church, but you might find this interesting anyway. Some of you are a part of Church of the Resurrection, so you had a chance to experience some of what I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But every year, Christmas Eve, and by the way, this was my 35th candlelight Christmas Eve. So I've been the pastor at Resurrection. This is now my 35th time to preach on Christmas Eve from year 0 when we were first born to year 34, so 35 times, and it's been a joy. One of probably my favorite experience of the year in ministry, well, that would probably be being with people, but in addition to that is preaching the candlelight Christmas Eve sermon. But it's also the time when we have more people show up by a factor of 4 or 5 than we do on a normal weekend. And so this year in person, we probably had, well, I know we had somewhere over 31,000 people who came in person. We had probably 2 to 3 times that number on TV and online. So you feel as a pastor, this is our Super Bowl. This is like the most important, weekend, or the most important set of services that you're going to have all year. And you long to get it right. You want so much to be able to speak to people. You want folks who never go to church who showed up. Maybe this would be the year when they go, okay, finally, I need this. I need what Christmas is all about. So a lot of pressure goes into that. And I began thinking about the candlelight Christmas Eve sermon. Rocky, go. Can you take him? He's found his favorite squeaky toy right while I'm recording this. But you feel this weight of this. And I began thinking about the candlelight Christmas Eve sermon and the Advent series, so the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas Eve, a month before Christmas Eve. And then during the springtime, thinking about it a little bit more. And this year we were going to focus on Matthew's telling of the Christmas story. So Luke is where we usually turn for Christmas Eve. It's got all of these wonderful details. But Matthew, he's pretty sparse on what happens at Jesus' birth. He has really just a few words. He says, Mary gives birth to a son. Joseph calls him Jesus, and that's it. But then right after that, he's got the story of the wise men, or the Magi. And I thought, well, this will be fun. We'll preach on the Magi this year for Christmas Eve and the child they were coming to seek. And usually that story is held, well, you'll hear this in a few minutes because I'm going to allow you to listen to the final version of the Christmas Eve sermon. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about just the process that goes into this. So, a couple weeks beforehand, I start working on the sermon, start doing the research and reading. I typically spend about 20 hours reading and researching and praying and writing for every message that I give. So about 20 hours. I look at it as though I was writing, I don't look at it this way, but it's as though I was writing a 10-page seminary paper, a master's level paper on whatever I'm preaching on. So a lot goes into that. I have footnotes. I've got it where it could be, it could be published at some point. And my aim is threefold. My aim in every message is that somehow the message speaks to the listener's intellect, that I teach them something they didn't know before, that there's a moment in which they go, wow, I never thought of it that way before, but I'm going to speak to their head and then their heart. I want to speak to their heart. And that's partly the Holy Spirit's work and partly what you do as a pastor and the stories that you tell or the way that you tell things. And so I hope to speak to their head and their heart, and then finally to speak to their hands, to have a clear call to action. Go out and do this now in response to the message. And these messages, my aim is to speak, to represent, if you will, God, to represent Jesus, to represent what the scriptures say well, and then to apply it to daily life. So head, heart, and hands. Teach something they didn't know, touch their hearts in some way, call them to action. And I think you'll hear that in the sermon that's at the end of my introduction. So I began working on that message. I had finally, usually I'll write 3 or 4 drafts of every message. And I had written 3 or 4 drafts going into Friday before Christmas Eve. So Friday before Christmas Eve, we record the sermon. And earlier that week, we had recorded the services, with the choir, orchestra, the band. We record the services for online and for TV. We have to record these in advance for TV because by Saturday at noon, they need the entire service. And we haven't even had a candlelight service yet. We need the entire service because they want to close caption it and have it ready so nothing goes wrong on Christmas Eve when they start broadcasting this. So Friday I recorded the sermon. I started at 2 o'clock. Again, prayer. I've got my manuscript there, and I preached through it once, and I'm like, yeah, I can do better than that. I feel like, and I'm looking right into the camera and trying to imagine all the people on the other side, and I think I can. That didn't come off the way I envisioned it in my head. So I said, let's do it again. So we recorded it a second time. Almost always, every week, I've recorded the sermon twice on Friday for Sunday's televised broadcast. So at the end of the second one, I thought, okay, that feels pretty good, but it was 5 minutes too long. And we started talking about what they could edit out and chop out. And I said, no, let me try it one more time. I really believe I can hit this at the right amount of time. And so I preached it one more time, and again I felt, you can tell sometimes where you feel like the Holy Spirit's working, and in your heart and in your mind when you're preaching it to yourself first before to anyone else. And by the time I was finished, it was the right length, and we said, okay, that's it. So that's a sermon that if you listened on television, if you were part of the how many 60,000 or how many people saw it on TV, that's the sermon that you heard with the service. And so then, Sunday morning came, and I helped lead worship, but I had someone else preaching. Sunday night, we had our first candlelight Christmas Eve service live. And this was we call it a traveler service for people who are leaving town and they won't be in Kansas City on Christmas Eve, or people have plans on Christmas Eve. And so we had a huge crowd, a really great crowd for that service. It was up considerably from last year. And we had, and so when I preached that sermon, I tweaked it just a little bit. So I said, okay, I tweaked it. By that time I knew I need more stories in this sermon. I didn't feel like I had enough stories. I had one big story and then the Christmas story itself, the wise men. And so I felt like I needed some more stories that would connect this to daily life. So for Sunday night at 5 o'clock, I added 3 stories to the sermon. And that's the sermon that we ended up sending to all of our locations for their services, because they started having, we have 8 locations in Kansas City. Some of them started having services on Monday night. And so we sent that version. And the difference between what I record on Friday for TV and what usually, and that's also what usually goes to the locations, is I'm looking straight in the camera like I am to you right now and imagining talking to the people on the other side. On Sunday night, I was turning and talking to the people in the room, and so I didn't look at the camera quite as often as I had wished to do. So we had to balance. Okay, it is somehow more meaningful if I'm looking right into the camera, but the message was maybe a bit better if we have the one I was talking in the room. So we use that one for the location. So if you attended Church of the Resurrection Candlelight at any of our other 7 area locations, that is the sermon that you received on Christmas Eve. And then so that was, Sunday night. Then on Monday, we had a service at 5 and at 7. At 5 o'clock on Monday night, I didn't eat lunch on December 23rd, and I really should have done that. And so by the time I recorded the sermon live with the congregation at 5 o'clock, so we have 2 services on the 23rd, 5 and 7. By the time I recorded the 5 o'clock service, I was feeling kind of crummy. I was feeling depleted. And so the energy level wasn't there for the 5 o'clock Christmas Eve. The sermon, I think, was a strong sermon, but it was it didn't have the energy that I would have wanted. And then 7 o'clock, I recorded the sermon once more. I didn't record it. I was preaching it live to the congregation at 7 o'clock. I'd had something to eat between the 2 services, and a reminder, eat well before you get up to preach. And the 7 o'clock, I thought, okay, I feel really good about that one. And so that was the sermon that we played the next night in the Foundry, our fellowship hall at Resurrection Leawood. So they got the Monday night at 7 o'clock. The locations got the Sunday night at 5 o'clock. The televised got the Friday at 5 o'clock when we recorded it for the 3rd time. So then it's Christmas Eve day. This may be really boring for you. I'm just giving you a little sense before you see the sermon as to, how these things evolve over time. But on Christmas Eve day, our first service was at 10 in the morning, and that's our children and family service. And it was awesome. We had children's choir and youth orchestra, and the music was great. And I thought the whole service went really well. But in the sermon, I tried to, on the fly, adapt this sermon for the children. And I added several sermon illustrations. I substituted illustrations for ones that involved children. And one of those had to do with a lemonade stand, and some kindergartners in our church who in November had a lemonade stand to help children and to have toys at Safe Home in Kansas City, where it's a domestic violence shelter. And mothers and their children escaped to there. And so there were kids there who didn't have toys. And these kindergartners had heard about it. And I happen to have a picture of them. And so I included that story in the kids service. Now, I will tell you, there's so much noise in the kids service that I always feel like I did a terrible job in preaching. And it's not about me. It's just, you get this feeling when you're done like, because I felt like tried to connect with the kids, but it was noisy. And so anyway, but by the time I came back at 3 o'clock, I ran home, wrapped some presents, I think, and then I made it back up there at 3 o'clock for the candlelight Christmas Eve service. And there we had 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 11 o'clock. And at 3 o'clock, it's like it all came together. It was the best of all the different ones, and I included the story about the children in the lemonade stand. They raised $1,277 from their lemonade stand, kindergartners, to be able to buy toys for children that they'd never met before. And it was just beautiful. And anyway, it seemed to all come together. It was a little longer than I wished, but it was like, you know what, this is the best I got, and it's long. And I told the staff afterwards, because our 3 and 5 were so jam-packed. I mean, it's overflow. People, especially 3 o'clock, we put people in the choir loft, we set up folding chairs, it was crazy. And I told the staff when I was done that if I were not the senior pastor, I would fire me for having that service run over as it did and the backlog in the parking lot. But I did feel, as people were walking out, it felt like this really spoke to them, and it felt like it spoke to me. So preach the same thing at 5 o'clock, and you'll hear that message, the 5 o'clock message, in just a minute. So now this is like, of all, the various iterations, this is the final iteration on Candlelight Christmas Eve live only in the sanctuary at Leawood. And I think all of them were pretty good. I hope they were good. That they were effective, or that somehow the Holy Spirit spoke through them. But the 5 o'clock, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11, I felt like that was the sermon in my head that finally came out just the way I hoped it would. And if you heard one of the other ones, I'm sure that but they were basically the same sermon. There were just a few tweaks to it. But I preached at 3, 5, 7, all those felt pretty good. At 7 o'clock, I was getting pretty weary because I hadn't eaten anything for quite a while. And so I remember I felt like I think it was the 7 o'clock, maybe it was the 9 o'clock, but I felt like my brain it was 9 o'clock. By the time I got to 9 o'clock, my brain was just tired. And I don't know if you've ever felt this way, where you were brain tired and you couldn't remember if you'd already said something. And the thoughts, I'm trying to preach without looking at my manuscript. And so as I'm preaching, it's like these thoughts are sort of jumbled up in my head. But anyhow, but I think even then, it seemed to speak to people. And by the time I got to 11 o'clock, I always feel this, it's like I catch this second wind, and I felt just so grateful. That's what I felt. I felt so grateful to get to be the senior pastor of this congregation, to get to preach a message that hopefully would stir the hearts of people and help them find Christmas and address, life as it is right now, and where we were in terms of politics and a whole lot of other things, but to really hopefully allow this story to speak to the hearts of people. And then at the end, to invite them to give in the Christmas Eve offering, which all benefits children in poverty outside of our church family. And so 11 o'clock, it was just fun. By the time I got there was, I don't know, it was maybe our smallest service, but it still had, I'm guessing, 1,500 people who came. And it was just beautiful. And then the very last thing I did is, after everybody left, now it's like 1:05 in the morning, and I walked back into the sanctuary for a few moments. There were some other people wandering in, so I got in there before anybody else was in there. And just, again, the evening's over. We've had tens of thousands of people show up. The lights are dimmed, and I looked up, and I just said, Jesus, thank you that I get to do this. Thank you for allowing me to be the senior pastor here. And I have got 5 more, I think I have 5 more Candlelight Christmas Eve services, or weekends. Christmas Eve, I got 5 more Christmas Eves before I retire, 5 or 6. And each time I tear up when I'm standing there in the sanctuary, and I think, thank you that I've had the privilege of getting to do this all these years. And what a blessing and joy to get to do this. And I felt Christmas in my heart. And it was, anyway, that's a little of the story. So you're going to have a chance to watch the 5 p.m. service right now, the sermon, not the service, but the 5 p.m. sermon. And I hope you'll enjoy it. That's our podcast for this week. I'll mention next week we start into a whole series on doubt based on my book, Wrestling with Doubt, Finding Faith. And next week's podcast is going to be In Praise of Honest Doubt, which was the name of my introduction to my book, Wrestling with Doubt, Finding Faith. And I think you'll enjoy it next week. And in fact, the entire month of January, we're going to be covering places where people struggle with doubt. And I hope really that's the essence of this podcast is to help people who wrestle with doubt to find faith, or for people to make sense of things that they hadn't maybe understood before. So hope you'll enjoy today, and you'll hear the attempt to try to speak to people's intellect, help them make sense of things, speak to their heart, and speak to their hands. And then starting next week, we'll be focused on questions of faith. I hope you had a blessed Christmas. I hope you have a great new year. Thanks for tuning in to the Making Sense of Faith podcast. Now, here's the 5 p.m. service from Christmas Eve Candlelight at Church of the Resurrection.
I want to greet once more those of you who are sitting in the narthex and look forward to at the end of the sermon when you come in and join us for the candlelighting. Thank you so much for being with us, and all of you for being with us today. So before we come to the candlelighting, we're going to focus on the Christmas story as told by the gospel writer Matthew. And it's a bit different story than the gospel writer Luke tells us. So in Luke, we read all of these details that we almost always focus on at Christmas time. But Matthew, there's hardly anything. So Matthew doesn't tell us anything about a census that required Mary and Joseph to go to Bethlehem. It doesn't tell us that there was no room in the inn or the guest room, and so they had to give birth in a stable. That's not in Matthew. It's in Luke. In Matthew, we don't read that the crib for the child, the Christ child, was the manger, the animal's feeding trough. It's not there. Matthew doesn't tell us about the shepherds who were keeping watch over their flock by night, or the angel of the Lord appearing to them and saying, we have bring you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David as a Savior. There's no angelic chorus crying out, glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace on all who he favors. None of that's in Matthew. So here's Matthew's entire account of Jesus' birth. Are you ready? Here it is. Mary gave birth to a son. Joseph called him Jesus. That's it. So you can see why we focus on Luke's story most of the time. But right after this very simple line about Jesus' birth, he says, in those days there came Magi from the east. And that's where we're going to focus today. He spends 12 verses describing the Magi that came from the east to pay homage to the Christ child. So today we're going to try to understand, who are these Magi, where did they come from, why did they come, what gifts did they bring, and why did they bring gifts, and what does any of that mean for us today? But first, one of you, knowing I was preaching on the wise men, sent me this meme. I think it was from Facebook. Take a look. And it says, unbeknownst to most theologians, there was a fourth wise man who was turned away for bringing fruitcake. Now, you may be a lover of fruitcake, and I'm sorry for that, but we won't be having any fruitcake in this sermon today. All right. So let's start by asking, who are these wise men? And we just sang We Three Kings, but they weren't kings. That's a tradition that developed much later. They were not kings. They had their own king in the land of Parthia, where they were from. So they weren't even called wise men by Matthew. They were called Magi. Magi. Now, there were two kinds of Magi in the time that Jesus was born. There were the fake Magi and the real Magi. The fake Magi were, many people consider them hucksters. They were people who told people's fortunes. They were people who gave people their horoscopes. They were people who, they looked at the stars, and they were also people who did magic tricks. So the word Magi became the base of our word magician, or magic. So there were Magi who were, they did it for a buck. But the real Magi were a class of noblemen. They lived in Persia, or at least that's where many of them began, was in Persia, ancient Persia, or in the time of Jesus, what was the Parthian Empire. And this is in modern day Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. That's where they were from. So they were stargazers. They did study the stars. They would be known as astronomers today, but they also believed, like astrologers, they believed that things that happen in the heavens sometimes were pointing to things that were going to happen here on earth. So maybe a full moon might mean something, or usually not a full moon, but a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse. Those were pointing towards things they thought were going to happen here on earth. So these were the wise men, the Magi. They were also priests of the Zoroastrian religion. Now, if you've not heard of that religion, it's still in existence. There's about 200,000 adherents around the world. Zoroastrianism believed in, like Judaism, it was a monotheistic faith by the time Jesus was born. They believed in one good, noble, and kind God who called humans to be good, noble, and kind towards one another. They believed in an afterlife. They believed in heaven and hell. They believed in a judgment day. They believed in demons and angels. And they also believed that one day their God would send an ideal king, a Messiah who would come. Now, this was very much like what the Jews believed. And there were Jews who lived in the Parthian Empire, and so they interacted with one another, and they probably influenced each other. The Zoroastrians came to believe in, I think they came to believe in the same Messiah that the Jewish people believed in. They knew the Jewish scriptures, and they believed that those prophecies that were talking about a Messiah who would come looked very much like the Messiah they were waiting for and looking for. Their God was a god named Ahura Mazda, and their prophet was Zarathustra. Now, I want to pause here and just recognize, people will ask me from time to time, how does God look at all the people of other religions? Are they all going to hell? Does God hate all the people of other religions? Well, in this passage, Matthew begins his gospel saying that God noticed the people of the Zoroastrian faith all the way over in Persia. And instead, in Matthew, he doesn't tell us about shepherds being invited to see the Christ child. God reaches out to these people who'd been trying to understand God and know God, and God honored them and blessed them and invited them to come and spoke to them in the way they were expecting, and that was through the stars. Even though the Bible doesn't really affirm astrology, God spoke to them in a way they could understand. And so when you read the Gospel of Matthew, you begin to see God cares about everybody. And Matthew is writing to Jewish Christians saying, look, it's not just about Jews. It's not even just about Christians. God cares about everybody. And Jesus came for everybody. All right, so what was the star they saw in the sky? And of course, some people will read this story and say, well, it's a legend. There probably wasn't any real star. But if you tend to take it a little more literally, and I tend to believe that the story, we could take it more literally. And as I look at the story, there are a couple of options for what the stargazers saw in the heavens. One might be a conjunction of planets, and that happens from time to time. Tonight, if the clouds weren't out, you would see the planet Jupiter moving across the southern sky. It's the brightest object in the southern sky right now. And sometimes the planet Saturn will come in conjunction. It will appear to be lined up with, they're millions of miles apart, but appear to be lined up with Jupiter. And so they might have seen a conjunction of the planets of Jupiter and Saturn, and maybe even of Mars there together. And so that might have been it, but I tend to think it wasn't that. I think it was probably a comet. Now, there was a comet that was recorded by the Chinese in 5 BC. So I think that was probably the comet that they saw. And you say, well, wait a minute, I thought Jesus was born in 0 BC. No, he wasn't. Our calendars are off by about 5 years. We know that Jesus was born before King Herod the Great died, and Herod the Great died in 4 BC, which means that Jesus must have been born before that. So 5 BC tends to make sense. How many of you saw the comet in October? Did anybody see it? Not very many of you. All right. Well, you had to look really carefully, and it was in the western, southwestern sky. Here's a picture of it I took with my iPhone from my backyard. Do you see it in there? Yeah, there it is. In case you can't see it, there it is right there. And there's the comma right here, and then there's the tail back here. And the comet, if you tended to think that things like this were signs of something, was pointing to the west by southwest. Now, if you happened to be a Magi and you saw a comet like this, you would have seen it in the morning sky first, which would have been in the east for them at just before sunrise. And then by the evening, you would have seen it in the western sky. And for about 3 weeks, you could see the comet I just showed you in the sky. Now, just to give you a sense, this is over here, Iraq. This is Iran. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are over here. And this is the capital city of the Parthian Empire. This may be where they were, or somewhere to the east of that. They saw a comet, and it was west. I'm going to assume it was west by southwest, which means from their vantage point, it looked like it was pointing this direction. And they only had to ask, well, what city is in that direction? And you first had to cross the desert, so there was no major cities here. And on the other side you had the Mediterranean Sea, but Jerusalem, you would hit Jerusalem right here. And so they traveled 750 miles across the Fertile Crescent, making an arc, not crossing the desert probably, and they came to Jerusalem. And you remember they came to Jerusalem asking King Herod, where is the child who was born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east, or at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. By the way, when I saw that comet, I thought, if I was the wise men, I would think that Jesus was going to be born in Wichita. Now, I've lived in Wichita, so I know better, but it's possible. Now, Wichita's a great city. But for these Magi, there was only one possible answer if there was a comet that was there, and that was Jerusalem. Does this kind of make sense to you? I think this is maybe how it works. And by the way, many people over the ages have thought this. So this is a fresco painted in 1305 by Giotto, and you can see the adoration of the wise men bringing their gifts here, and there's the Christ child here, and up here you have a comet in the sky that was pointing the direction of Jerusalem. And ultimately, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is several miles south of Jerusalem. All right, so you say, well, what does any of that have to do with the Christmas, what Christmas means for us today? Nothing, actually. I just thought it was interesting. I thought you might enjoy it too, so. But here's where we're going to get into what this means for us. So why did the Magi come? Why did they take 30 days, which is how long it would have taken if they were in their capital city? Why did they travel 30 days at great cost and some risk, and they brought expensive gifts? Why would they have done this? And they told the people in Jerusalem, we've come seeking the newborn King of the Jews. But why would these people who were Zoroastrians in the Parthian Empire with their own king, why would they come seeking this newborn king? Why was it so important to them? That's the question I want to ask right now. So they had a king. Their king's name was Phraates IV. Phraates IV. And here's a picture of Phraates IV from a coin that was minted during his reign. So he must have liked the image because he had it put on a coin. And so that's what he looked like. You're seeing what Phraates IV looked like. And so here is this man, and they have a king. They're looking for a different king. Let me tell you just a little bit about this king, Phraates IV. So he came to power in 37 BC, and he ruled until 2 BC, so he ruled until Jesus was 3 years old. He ruled over the Parthian Empire, and the kings there were called King of Kings. That was their title. They weren't emperor, they were King of Kings. If you've read the Bible, you recognize that title because you get to the book of Revelation, and Jesus is called the King of Kings. So the biblical authors are saying it's not the king of the Parthians that's the King of Kings. It's Jesus. He's the King of Kings. All right, so what was Phraates IV like, and why were they searching for a different or a better king? Well, in 37 BC, he came to power. His dad was the king, but he got tired of waiting for his dad to die. So he expedited the process. Are you with me? And so his father dies, and he and his older brother take over the throne, but he's not really fond of sharing the throne with his older brother. So guess what happens to his older brother? Mysteriously, he dies. And then Phraates' father had many wives, and he had 30 other sons, half-brothers and stepbrothers, 30. Guess what happened to all 30 of them? They mysteriously died. So are you getting the impression that this king is not such a great king? So he has 4 sons. He has 5 sons, but his 4 oldest sons, he sends to Rome in exile because he wants to make sure his youngest son, who's too little to challenge his throne, his youngest son will become king. He then wages war. He wages war against the Jews in Palestine. He wages war against the Egyptians to conquer the Egyptians and take them away from the Romans. He wages war against the Romans in Armenia, and then he wages war in the eastern end of his empire against the other kingdoms there. You get a sense that he wasn't a very peace-loving king, right? He wasn't a really great guy. And you know how he met his end in 2 BC? He met his end because his wife poisoned him to death, which tells you a little something about how she felt about it. So as we look at the story, we ask, why did the Magi travel for 30 days, across the Fertile Crescent to find a newborn king? Because they needed a better king. They wanted a different kind of king. And so they came to honor him and pay him homage. They hoped that he might be the kind of king that came from God that might set the world aright. By the way, when it comes to the Magi, just a little piece. Would you like to see what they looked like? So would you put up that picture of the Magi, what they looked like? And so the images that you're about to see, there you go. The gold ones are from about 300 BC. And these are Magi, and on the right is a bust, a head of a Magi from about 200 BC. I just think that's kind of cool to think. They were real human beings. They were not these Magi, but they were Magi who, they looked something like that. Anyway, so they came in search of a better king. All right, I'm thinking about our time now. And, every 4 years, we celebrate Candlelight Christmas Eve after an election for president. So it's always interesting because we spend a year and a half, and there's drama, high drama, and there's divisiveness and polarization, and there are debates, and there's divisions in our society. And then eventually we elect a president. And of course, our election this year, 49.9% voted for President Trump, 48.4% voted for Vice President Harris. And we end up, after the election, finding ourselves some feeling hopeful and excited, and some feeling scared or anxious. But we gather here tonight, and we're Democrats and Republicans. None of you asked what's your party affiliation when you walked in. We didn't check. You walk in this room, and here's the thing. We are united, not in our celebration of who the next president will be. Some are you excited, some not. We are united because we've come to celebrate the birth of our king. There have been 11 presidents in my lifetime. So I was born in 1964, and President Johnson was fulfilling Kennedy's term after Kennedy had been killed. Then Johnson was reelected, and then in 1968, Nixon was elected, and then in 1972, Ford took over after Nixon resigned his office. Ford was president for a couple of years, then President Carter. Then after Carter came Reagan, and after Reagan came Bush 1. After Bush 1 came Clinton. After Clinton came Bush 2. After Bush 2 came Obama. After Obama came Trump. After Trump came Biden. After Biden came Trump. 11 presidents. Now you know this, none of them were perfect. They were all fallible human beings. In some ways, they were all a bit of a mess, and in some ways, they were pretty good. Some of them more good than others, but they were just, and all of them made some terrible mistakes, and all of them did some really good things. And sometimes people surprised us that they did better than we thought they were going to do. But here's the thing. I don't look to the president to be my source of hope in life. I don't look to the president to be my guiding force or my guiding light in life, to tell me how I should live my life or what I should be doing. I look to Jesus for that. And though I've had 11 presidents, I've only had one king that entire time. And the king is a higher authority. The King of Kings is a higher authority than anybody else. And so we come together today and we're united in this, that there's the birth of a king we're celebrating who calls us to the kingdom of God, this ideal kingdom here on this earth where people love one another. The Magi were looking for a king like that. The psalmist described him. I'm guessing they knew the Psalms. Psalm 72:4 describes him as a king that would defend the cause of the poor of the people. The prophet Isaiah said of the king, "Unto us a child has been born, unto us a son is given, and authority rests upon his shoulders. He is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father," and here it is, Prince of Peace. Can you see why they were looking for him after the king that they had? Now, Christians read the gospel stories, and in particular Matthew and Luke, which tell us the birth of Jesus, and there Jesus is given a name by the angel Gabriel. So Mary is told, you're going to have a baby, and here's the name you're going to give him. She didn't get to pick the name. The angel told her, Gabriel. The word angel means messenger, by the way. The messenger of God told her, you're to call him Jesus. Joseph, you don't get to pick the name. God has chosen the name. His name shall be called Jesus. Actually, that's not what the angel said. The angel said you should call him Yehoshua. Yehoshua was Hebrew for Yahweh saves, Yahweh rescues, Yahweh helps, Yahweh delivers. And it was shortened from Yehoshua to Yeshua, and then eventually in Greek to Jesus, and in English to Jesus. But that's what it means. He saves, he rescues, he helps. Why do any of us need to be saved or rescued or helped? Now, a lot of times we talk about saving from sin. And sin simply means this. It means to stray from the path. It means you said something you shouldn't have said. You did something you shouldn't have done. You hurt somebody else. You walked away from the right path. You failed to do the thing that you should have done. That's sin, and everybody does it, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're an atheist. We got to acknowledge we all stray from the path of what we think is right sometimes. So we need to be saved from the messes that we make, but we also need to be saved from loneliness and despair and hopelessness and a whole host of other things. And Jesus came to do that. He came to embody, to put flesh on God's willingness to help us, to redeem us, to rescue us, to save us, to forgive us. He came to do that. Then Matthew says his name shall be called Emmanuel. He's quoting from the prophet Isaiah. Emmanuel means God is with us. So he came to put flesh on the fact that God is always with us, to say there really is a God, that God knows you, loves you, cares for you, and is always with you. You may know the most frequently given command in the Bible is not love your neighbor. It is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. So whenever you hear that command, don't be afraid, what comes after that is because God is with you. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And so Jesus came to embody that, to say, look, he really is with you. You are never alone, even when you feel alone. You are not unloved because there is one who loves you with a relentless love. Trust in that. And then finally, when we get to the end of the service, we're going to read John's gospel when we light the candles, John's account of Christmas. And there he says that light came into the darkness and the darkness could not overcome it. And so when we look at Jesus, we see God's light coming into the world. And in our lives, we recognize there are times that are dark. And there are times in our world that are dark and hopeless. And he came to be light in the darkness and say, no matter what, the darkness does not get to have the final word. Evil, hate, sin, and death, they never have the final word. This is part of what we remember and learn from Christmas. And which of us doesn't need these things? A Prince of Peace, a God who is with us all the time, a God who forgives, a God who loves us, a God who is light in our darkness. All right, but how do we appropriate any of those things? How do we really take advantage? How do we experience that in our lives? And the first step is by faith, of course. And so faith is trusting in something. And faith doesn't just happen to you. You actually choose to have faith. Like, I realize I could choose not to have faith. I could choose to believe there is no God and none of this is true and it's all a fairy tale. Or I could choose to say, you know what, in this case, I actually believe this is true. And I think it's worth banking my life on. And so I believe that, and then I trust it. And then I talk to Jesus, and I sing, and I pray, and I go to church and read scripture, and all of those things help, reinforce my faith. And yet, there are times we need more than just faith. I remember when my youngest daughter, Rebecca, and those of you Resurrection folks have heard this story before, but we have two daughters, Danielle and Rebecca, and when they were little, we lived behind the church. They were in elementary school. And Rebecca, when she was about 7 or 8 years old, she would be awakened by any storm that came in the middle of the night. So our bedroom was on one end, the girls' bedrooms were on the other end, and whenever there was a storm, Danielle slept right through it. Rebecca would come running to our bedroom, and she would come to my side of the bed, and she would shake me and say, Daddy, are you awake? Are you awake? Daddy, are you awake? And I'm like, I am now. What do you need? And she said, I'm scared. The storms. I'm scared, Daddy. And so I would swoop her up in my arms, and I would take her back to her bedroom, and I'd lay her down in the bed, and I'd kneel next to her bed, and I would pray with her. And then I would say, now, Rebecca, you know Jesus is with you all the time. He's here in the room with you right now, and you're going to be okay. And she said, Daddy, I know that's true, but sometimes I need someone with skin. And the truth is, all of us sometimes need someone with skin. And so we're meant to embody or put skin on Jesus. The word putting skin on is incarnation. We are meant to incarnate Jesus in the world. So we are meant to be God rescues or God helps. We are meant to be God is with us all the time. We are meant to be instruments of the Prince of Peace, or the one who seeks to care for the poor and the needy. We are meant to be all of those things. And this was Jesus' grand plan. So years ago, I was in the Holy Land, and I had a wonderful Jewish guide. And I've been there many, many times, but this particular guide, his name was Michael, and he knew Jesus better than any of the Christians on our trip except me. He was a really, a great scholar of Jesus. And he said, I love Jesus, and I love what he taught. I love the things that he did. He said, but I don't believe he's the Jewish Messiah. And I said, why do you not believe he's the Messiah? And he said, because he didn't do all the things that the prophets said he would do. He didn't bring world peace. He didn't solve all the world's problems. He didn't take away all the pain in the world. And if the Messiah had come, I think he would do that. And I said, well, I appreciate that, understanding that's where you're coming from. I said, here's a different way of looking at it. I think he came to show us what God wants from us. And then he called people to follow him. And then he expects us to go do those things. I don't think he drops down world peace from heaven. I don't think he drops food down from heaven very often. I think he's saying, look, you're to be me now. And before he left this earth, he told his disciples, now you go and do all the things that I taught you and teach other people to do those things. And that, I think, is how it works. We are his strategy for changing the world. So last week, actually, one of our staff members who works with our senior adults, pastor of senior adults, Emily, was at Kingswood Manor Retirement Home at 102nd and Warnell. And she and a group of our resurrection members were there having a candlelight Christmas Eve service in the memory unit for people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And many of them don't remember their names. They can't make sense. You can't make sense when you're talking to them. And they handed them little battery-operated candles like some of the kids have here. And they began singing the carols. And she videotaped this. It was really beautiful to see these resurrection members who were putting skin on the love of Jesus for people that didn't remember their names anymore. You see how beautiful that is? But she started videotaping because there was a woman named Roma who was in a wheelchair, and Roma couldn't talk. As far as I know, she didn't talk. She didn't remember her name. She didn't remember anything. And they started singing Silent Night, Holy Night. And all of a sudden, Roma belted it out. She was way off key, and she was the loudest person in the room. But there was something beautiful about being surrounded by these resurrection people who put on a service for her, and suddenly she remembered who she was and whose she was. That's how this works. Or I think about the first time I went to Malawi. I've been to this little sliver of a country in South Central Africa a number of times, but the first time was about 20 years ago. And there are United Methodists there, and we were looking for a place to serve in Africa, and one of our members had been there, and so they said, well, come on down. So we flew to Johannesburg, South Africa, then took a little plane and landed on a dirt runway in Lilongwe, Malawi. The van picked us up, and it drove us for about 3 hours into a place like nothing I'd ever seen before. I mean, there was no electricity, there was no water, there was watering holes, that's what they had. And people lived in mud huts. And so we're traveling out there, there's 8 of us, and we had been praying, Jesus, if there's something you want us to do, would you please help us to see what it is? And we showed up there, and there was a translator, and there were 4 tribal chiefs, and we met all the children and the people in the village, a village of a couple hundred people maybe. And the tribal chief said, we've never seen people like you. They'd never seen people who looked like me before. And they said, we have been praying to Jesus that he would give us clean drinking water. And, well, where do you get your water from? Well, come on. And we walked a half a mile to this watering hole where everybody was there with, white plastic buckets and pulling out water and taking it back to their houses. And it was green and brown and muddy, and it was nothing you'd ever, ever, ever want to drink. And they said, our children get sick from drinking this water, but this is the only water we have. And we know that there are wells in other cities. They call them boreholes, but we can't do that here. And so we're praying for Jesus to give us a well. And instead, he gave us 4 white people from America. Well, we had dinner that night, and our group talked about it and said, well, does anybody have a sense of what Jesus wants us to do here? And it didn't take a brain surgeon to figure this out. There was water several hundred yards underground. It just took $3,000 to be able to build a borehole to get to it. And we came back to Resurrection, and we shared this, and we built a borehole for them. And this month, we drilled our 200th borehole in Malawi, 200 villages across Malawi, with now thousands and thousands of people have clean drinking water because 4 tribal chiefs have been praying that somebody would show, that Jesus would give them a borehole. And see how it works? Jesus doesn't drop a well out of heaven. His strategy is to call his people to go do something, right? That's how it works. The last thing I'll tell you, last little story is, it was November, when our children's Sunday school, we gave all of our kids $5. Like, hey kids, if you want to get $5, come to children's Sunday school in November. And so they did, and we said, we'd like for you can spend this money on yourself for candy or something else, or you could use it and try to multiply it even, and use it to help other people. And so they came up with all kinds of fun things they were doing. There was 3 kindergartners, little girls in the kindergarten class, and they decided to pool their $5, and they got 2 or 3 friends who chipped in as well. And so there was, I think, 5 kindergarten girls, and they decided that they would have a lemonade stand. And they'd heard from one of their neighbors about a place called Safe Home here in Kansas City. And Safe Home is a place where mommies and their children can go when it's dangerous to live at home anymore with their daddies. And they heard that those children often had to leave and they didn't have enough toys. And so they told their mommies and daddies that they wanted to buy toys. They wanted to have a lemonade stand and buy toys for these children. So they said, we're going to pool our $5. So they bought lemonade, and they made up a little lemonade stand, and they asked their parents to make up flyers for them, and they took them to all the neighbors and saying, we're raising money in our lemonade stand to help children at Safe Home. And here's a picture of the girls with their stand. And I love this. And they ended up selling enough lemonade to raise $1,277, these 5 little kindergartners, to buy toys for children whose names they didn't know, but who'd been through trauma in their homes. Do you see the strategy, how this works? In Sunday school, they learned this because Jesus taught us these things, and we're trying to live this out. But you don't have to be in a nursing home, go to a nursing home. You don't have to go to Malawi or run a lemonade stand in order to follow Jesus and to be skin for Jesus, to put on flesh on Jesus. Because every single one of you, I promise you, I can almost 100% guarantee you that every one of you sometime this coming week, well, maybe you're off work, so maybe not this week, maybe the next week, you're going to run into somebody who needs a friend, somebody who needs someone to wrap their arms around them and say, hey, it's really good to see you. Are you doing okay? Or somebody who needs food, or somebody who needs to laugh, or somebody who needs to cry. I mean, if you pay attention, and if you take your marching orders from the King of Kings, then he's going to guide you, and you're going to have a chance to be the flesh of Jesus for someone else. All right, here's the last story I want to share with you today. Last month, we had a big group of people join the church. About 185 people joined the church at this location mostly, and some of our other locations. And one was a couple, mom and dad and their daughter Lachlan, so Steve and Heather and Lachlan. I didn't get a chance to meet them after they joined. They just started coming a couple weeks before. But I learned the next week that Heather had been diagnosed with a very frightening brain tumor and a really scary prognosis. And I called them and I said, she was going in for surgery the next day. And I said, I can't be there for the surgery. I know one of our other pastors is going to be there, but I wanted to have a chance to pray with you tonight. And we talked and we prayed. And then I stopped by the hospital, after she was already in surgery, and prayed with her husband, Steve. And then she was here at the church last week. She had been through rehab, and they removed most of the tumor, and she was here picking up her new member packet. And so I said, hey, come into my office. I want to talk to you. And her mom was there too. And so she came in, and I said, tell me your story. How'd you come to be at the church? And she said, well, we moved here 5 years ago, and we never really got involved in a church. And she said, I went to the doctor. I was having these headaches. I went to the doctor, and the doctor found I had this kind of cancer, this tumor. And it was terrifying. And I got home that day, and some of my neighbors knew this was happening, or knew this was possible. And I'd called one of them. I think she'd called them. And she said, I ended up at home, and I was just so afraid. I was overwhelmed. And she said, I began writing down on a piece of paper. I wrote these sentences down. I need God. And I need to know that he'll forgive me. And I want to know if there really is a heaven and how I get there. And I want to know someday that my husband and my daughter will be with me there, someday long years from now. And she said, I'd written that down. I was so afraid. And she said, then there came a knock on the door, and there was a woman named Kelly who's standing there on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers. And she said, anything. I will do anything for you. These flowers are just a sign of that. I will do anything for you. How can I help? And she said, right now, I'm just really scared, and I need God. And I wondered, do you go to church anywhere? And Kelly said, I go to Church of the Resurrection. Can I connect you with one of our pastors? And she connected her with Max, and she came up and met with Max, and Max answered her questions. And at the end of that, Max and Heather prayed, and Heather said yes to Jesus. Jesus, I need you, and I need you to forgive me. And I want to go to heaven someday, and I just need to know you're with me. Okay, I want to pause here for a second. She said after that, she said, I have felt his presence every day since then. And sometimes it's just in my heart, and sometimes it's the way people have just wrapped their arms around me and love me. And she said, I don't know what the future holds, but now I know I belong to him. I don't know, most of you will not have a brain tumor. Most of you are, maybe you're doing fine right now. But I guarantee you this, all of you are going to walk through a dark place somewhere along the way. And Jesus came and you need him. You need to know that God rescues you and saves you and delivers you and forgives you, and that God walks with you no matter what, all the time. And you need to know that God wants to set the world aright and wants to use you to be a part of setting it aright. You need all of that. You need Jesus to be your king. And the way you do that is just to say yes. It's so simple. Like he's saying, will you let me be your king? And all you have to say is yes. So I'm going to try something here. We're not going to raise a hand or close your eyes or anything else. I'm just going to ask you, we're having a conversation. Would you you can whisper it under your breath. You don't even have to say it out loud. Whisper it under your breath, or you can just think it if you're worried about what somebody's going to think about you sitting next to you. But I wonder if you might just say what Heather said. Would you just, right now, if you feel like you want to do this, you might just say, Jesus, I need you. Just in your thoughts or whisper it under your breath. Jesus, forgive me. Jesus, help me. Thank you, Jesus, for loving me. Jesus, be my king. That's how it works. Every morning I wake up and I say a prayer like that every day. Here I am, Lord. I'm yours. Be my king. Okay, I want to wrap it up. So, the Magi, they come searching for a better king. They traveled 30 days. They finally see this house. They've gone to Jerusalem. They were told by the people in Jerusalem, well, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. So they travel into Bethlehem. They find the house where the Christ is. He's not in a stable. He's in a house at this point, the Christ child. He finds the mother and they find the mother and father, and they rejoice that they found him. And then they bow down on their knees like they're paying homage, like they're worshiping. They bend the knee to their newborn king. And they offer him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each of those gifts, scholars think probably, they had a symbolic meaning. Gold was a gift for a king, and frankincense was used as an offering to God. And so the priest would offer it to God. So they were pointing to the fact that Jesus was king, but he was also a priest who would offer himself on behalf of the people. And then myrrh was used in preparing a body for burial. And it was pointing to the fact that Jesus, this baby, would die an early death. But Mary and Joseph didn't understand that. And I don't think the wise men did either. I think they just brought something valuable to bring to the child. Now, shortly after that, and what we're going to turn to next week in worship, is King Herod, who was paranoid and had already killed 2 of his children and his favorite wife because he was afraid they were going to take over control. When he heard from the Magi that there was a king who was born king of the Jews, became hyper-paranoid, and he sent his soldiers to Bethlehem to kill all the babies there. And Mary and Joseph, hearing that the soldiers were coming, fled by night, and they fled to Egypt, and they became refugees. And the only way they could survive was selling gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Christians began celebrating Christmas not right away. It was a couple hundred years later, several hundred years later, after the birth of Christ. They celebrated Easter first. But when people started giving gifts at Christmas time, they didn't give them to each other. They looked for needy children in their community. They looked for the poor, because Jesus came to bring good news to the poor. That's who they exchanged gifts with. And then St. Nicholas came along, which we know St. Nicholas became St. Nicholas, or Santa Claus. And so, love Santa Claus. Here's the earliest image of Santa Claus, by the way, St. Nicholas. This is from about the year 900. And he was an ordinary guy who began to follow Jesus, and then he decided to dedicate his life to Jesus, and he became a priest. And then eventually he was elected a bishop. And his parents, when they died, left him a substantial inheritance, and he decided that he would devote the rest of his life to ministering to people and giving that away to help children and families who were in need. And so as he still does to this day, he cares about children, and he would put coins in stockings. And if there was a home of a family that was poor, he would either leave it outside or he would throw it through an open window at night. And this was the tradition that began around Santa Claus, around St. Nicholas. 15 years ago as a church, we said, what would happen if we tried to restore this idea of what Christmas is on Candlelight Christmas Eve. Now, this is the biggest night of the year. It's our Super Bowl. And we'll have tens of thousands of people join us online, TV, and in person. And we said, what if we just gave away the entire Christmas Eve offering to benefit children in poverty, children and their families? And this service is a gift from us to you. Nothing you give tonight is going to go to pay for anything here at Resurrection. But what would happen if we found projects that we could work alongside, we could know they were going to make a difference? What would happen if we could do that and help children who are in need? So that's what we began doing. And last year, I want you to know, you gave $2.2 million in one night on Christmas Eve. One of the projects, the biggest one, was a mobile dental clinic. And we hope to have it here tonight, but it's getting ready to be painted. Here's a picture of it. And it will be here at the end of January. And it's going to be then, once we dedicate it, given to Swope Health Systems, where they're going to take it out to low-income schools in Kansas City and provide free dental care all day, every day, Monday through Friday, for kids who are in need. How cool is that? And you made that possible. I wanted you to hear about 2 of the 20 projects that your Christmas Eve offering is going to support today. And one of them is Operation Breakthrough at 31st and Troost. And you're going to hear from Mary Esselman, who's the CEO and executive director, and their hope to create an even greater ministry and connection with developmentally delayed preschoolers to change their lives. And then the other is a couple that have just got back from Malawi, and they're going to show you the light projects, the solar light projects we've participated in, a little bit of the agriculture, and you're going to help fund that and so much more. These are just 2 of 20 projects. Take a listen.
I think it's probably the most important work in the city, and it's all about providing education, social services, and health for some of Kansas City's most vulnerable children. And today we actually are from cradle to career. And for our little ones, it's all about meeting those developmental milestones. For our school agers, it's staying on track. And for our teens, it's all about workforce development and entrepreneurship. So these are all kids that would not get a chance to go to any preschool, childcare, anything outside of the home. They would just go straight into kindergarten. Last year's class, only 5% of them would have entered school ready, 87% after having that year. The Christmas Eve offering is going to help us add a classroom here at Operation Breakthrough. It's going to allow us to really focus on children with high needs. When the community wraps its arms around our most vulnerable children and families, it makes a true difference and it allows our children to thrive.
I love that our Christmas Eve offering goes not only to kids here locally, but also globally. And it's a great opportunity to say that you had a part. You had a part to play in bringing education and permaculture and all the things that we want to see continue to prosper in those areas. You get to see that happen. We were able to go at night to a community. They recently received solar lights, and to see how that impacted these families was so tremendous. We went into one family's house. They had 5 school-age kids. The parents told us through a translator how the light had totally changed their children's perspective of school and how much more they were learning and they were developing. We also went to a school that received the solar lights as well in that same community, and it was almost 7 o'clock at night, and there were about 60 to 70 kids in one room that late at night just reading and studying together.
I see it as those kids now that they have more food on the table, that when they come to school, they have a place where there's even more fun things for them, more variety of books to read and things to learn. When they come home at night, they're not afraid of being outside because the lights are on.
I mean, we always talk about Jesus being the light, and he's the light of the world, and you could see just the joy in their faces in the light. And so it's just that practical, tangible thing of the light coming to the world and that star shining brightly.
How cool is that? And you have a chance to participate in that. So every year at Christmas Eve, after the sermon, we take the offering, and you get to be the Magi, bringing gifts to the child, the Christ child. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how you can do that in just a moment. But I want you to know, finding the Christ. So being Magi, that's what you are tonight, looking for the Christ. And then when you find him, you're called to be a light pointing others to the Christ, like Kelly was for Heather and for Steve and Lachlan. And then finally, again, you're meant to be the Magi, bringing your gifts to help children who are in need. And when you do all of those things, what you find is what the Magi found, because Matthew tells us their hearts were filled with joy. That's where you find joy. So I'd like to invite you to pray with me if you would. God, we thank you so much for the gift of Christmas and all that it represents. Help us to trust in your unfailing love. We ask that Jesus would be our King. We pray that you would help us to be light in this world of darkness and to, as Robert Louis Stevenson has said, punch holes in the darkness together. God, help us to punch some big holes in the darkness tonight. In Jesus' holy name, amen.
Thanks for tuning in to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. Do you know someone wrestling with life's biggest questions? Share this episode with them, because the more people willing to embrace the hard questions, the better. Do you want to go deeper? You can visit makingsenseoffaith.com to find the show notes and additional resources. That's also where you can sign up to get the notes and resources delivered straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe and leave us a rating in your podcast player. That'll make sure that you get the latest episodes and help others find the podcast. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell to catch future episodes and videos there. Until next time, remember that your questions matter. Doubts are normal, and making sense of faith is a lifelong journey. We'll see you on the next episode of Making Sense of Faith.